It's always good to have something besides words for people that deal exclusively almost in words. And singing is the way to do it. I know that I saw a couple of people here that were tearing up at some of those songs, some of the lyrics and the way they flow out. So we're all warmed up now, and Don would be saying, okay, let's get busy. Let's get business going. We're here to celebrate the life of Don Welch. His last book was edited by Mr. Spieker, and he will be here soon. Spieker, I guess I'll get that right in a minute. Dwaine will be here soon. He said there was a bridge out somewhere near Dodge, Nebraska, so we had to backtrack. He did call me and gave me a play-by-play. He didn't say how soon before he saw the bridge was out or if he screeched to a halt, but I'll let him tell that story. So, we do have Jeff Lacey here. He's a publisher with Rogue Faculty Press, and he's going to talk a little bit about the book and talk about small press in Nebraska, talk about his friendship with Don, and then also bring up a really interesting idea about book fairs and book walks and things like that. He has a number of poems of Don in frames. He is going to put a couple of Don's books up here that you can use if you want to read something and you don't have a book with you. Grab a book and look up the poem that you want, and then put it back on the table for the next person. So that'll work out. So, without further ado, we'll have Jeff Lacey come up, and he will help us out. Jeff.
Everybody, how you doing? Thanks for coming out in the rain. I wasn't supposed to speak first originally. Dwaine Spieker was supposed to kind of MC this and give you a little talk about Don's work and his life, and but I'm just as good. I can start. This is a good room. It's a good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my role. My friend Calvin Banks, who is also on his way, is we put this together with Dwaine and Don a few years ago, and we're really proud of it. It was really a labor of love. We worked on it really carefully. And if you don't know too much about Don, I'm going to talk a little bit about his relationship to me, and then I'm going to talk about these poems that are there, and what the purpose of this night is a little bit. And and I'll start there. The real purpose of the night is to celebrate the work of Don Welch. He touched so many people. He taught so beautifully for so long. And we're here just to celebrate that man and his work with his words, and also hopefully a blending of our own. My relationship with Don, and I'm going to refer to my notes here. So when I was the joke in my house, the family joke in my house was that my house was full of love and it was full of respect for each other. But as far as art goes, it was a little thin. For example, my brothers and I had this joke. We had a total of 10 records, like phonograph records in our house. That was the sum total of our music. We weren't a musical family. And half of them were marching bands of the Big 8 series. And the other half was a nice blend between Neil Diamond and Barbra Streisand. So it was a nice, and so as a kid who wanted to find his place in the world and had an impulse towards art, I went out searching when I went to college, and really one of the people I found that really helped me find myself was Don Welch. I was in his intro to poetry class, and I just couldn't get enough, and then I took his advanced poetry class and a graduate seminar in prosody, and just emails after that, after I graduated, emails and cups of coffee, and he never stopped supporting me. He never stopped supporting me, and he never forgot who I was. And as a poet, when I read his work, it was something so sacred and real to me when I would read it that it was almost, at first, it was almost kind of dizzying. And I'm going to read this part from my notes because I want to get this right. But Ted Kooser. Does anybody know Ted Kooser?
Yeah.
He has a chapter in the book, Spoken Word Revolution, which is wild. But he has a chapter in Spoken Word Revolution. It's pretty interesting, but one of the ideas he floats in there is that all jobs more or less trace back to a handful of original jobs. there were things like food, shelter, and clothing, and he puts what he calls spirituality in this camp. So he said it was one of these original jobs, and he declares these jobs essential, right? And there were medicine men and priests and medicine women and artists, and the ones who dipped their fingers into red clay and bone ash and crushed lime and first put paintings on walls. And there were people who were charged to stand under stars and around fires and tell stories to people when you weren't looking for food and shelter. And so there were people that, like, and artists and poets fall into this family of essential jobs. So that is what he was to me. He was, and I say, he told me stories that we should remember, whether they were over wine-dark seas, or up through the spirals of hell, or through the alleyways of a Midwestern town. These stories were essential. And this is what Don was to me. He was one of these people. He wasn't essential to me. So that's how his work felt. And it grounded me, and I'm 42, I'm still here talking about it. So it was good. So thank you, Don, and may God bless you. And now I'm going to talk about what I'm here. I want to say some thank yous. I want to say thank yous to Rex. Where did Rex? For putting this together. And I want to say thank you to Dwaine Spieker, who just, how's the bridge? Did you get across the bridge?
I did not.
Oh, good. Okay, you're here, though. That's an interesting sentence. That was an interesting exchange. And I'd like to thank my friend Calvin Banks. Calvin, could you come up and turn, we'll see Dwaine in a second. Calvin probably might not read, but this is the artist who designed the cover of the book, so he put a lot of love into this. And Marcia especially, and the family, and the Welch family, so thank you very much for the honor of working on this. And the last thing I want to say is that I want to talk about the sharing piece of it. First of all, anybody who knew Don knew that he was a craftsman of poetry, and the poem on the page was just as valuable and as important as when you hear it aloud. Because it's a beautiful thing to hear people talk aloud. It's a beautiful thing to hear those speaking, but a lot of the times, whether it's because of time and space or whatever, but what you've got is you in a book, alone in a room reading their work, right? And so the craftsmanship on the page is an incredibly valuable and special thing, and Don celebrated that. He worked at that all the time. So what I've done, I kind of tried to think of something that would kind of synthesize the idea of the poem as a spoken word, and also something that's almost like physical artifact. So what you see some poems back at those tables and over here. Please, in lulls of readings, or maybe even after the thing's done, come around and look, and it's designed as a gallery walk. I call it a Welch walk, to celebrate poetry, not just heard, but also to be looked at and to appreciate it for the craftsmanship. Because if you look at some of his stanzas, they're just impeccably done, and they're beautiful that way. So I encourage you to go on a little Welch walk and look over those poems. And it would be a great way, if you knew Don, to remember him, like when the poems first arrived, and him just chipping away at them and crossing things out, and maybe a little frustrated, but probably always happy. So I encourage you to go on that Welch walk. And can I get the hawk? Can I call dibs on the hawk? Are you ready? No? Okay. Oh, you want it? You want it? Okay. I won't steal. Here's another thing, the last thing I'm going to talk about, and like Rex said, I'm going to put this book up here, and if you've never done a poetry reading in your life, some of you might have come with spouses, you might just be here for the love of I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to put this book up here, and I want this to be a communal book, and anybody who wants to come up and even if you just want to pick a poem at random, come up and celebrate his work, have some fun with it, and we'll just leave it here on this table, and you can come up and share some of his work if you've never read it before, and I especially want somebody to read for the first time at a reading. I see some plans like, nope, I'm not. And that's okay too. You can just sit and enjoy. But thank you very much. Welcome. And I'm going to bring up to the mic Dwaine Spieker. Are you ready, Dwaine? You feel? All right. Thank you very much.
My usual route from Wayne to Lincoln takes under 2 hours typically. Today, the little oiled road I take that's a shortcut between Wisner and Dodge, there was a bridge out. I don't know if Rex told you that. Driving it up there is like driving in the movie Mad Max. A just slightly more fertile version, cornfielded version of Mad Max. And when I saw that bridge out, I missed the sign saying a bridge was out 1 mile ahead because I was thinking about what I was going to say. I have to say I looked at the bridge for a moment and I thought, can I make it over? Can I, you know? Yeah, I was really tempted, so I ended up having to go back and lose about 20 minutes backtracking, so I'm sorry about that. One of my pet peeves in life is being late, so I'm sorry. The book, Homing, was about 2 years in the making. Its genesis, though, was much earlier than that. I really honestly can't put my finger down on exactly when I first got the idea. I do know that the earliest it could have been was the fall of 1995 when I enrolled in Don's poetry class. And I enrolled in the class after I knew I wanted to do some writing in life. I didn't know what kind, and I had tried a lot of different genres except poetry. And thanks to Jeff Lacey, who told me the spring before, he said, "Dwaine, you got to take this class." And I did, and I was very happy that I did. It took maybe 2 or 3 sessions of the class before I realized that, something important and serious is happening in my life, and I need to wake up. Probably before the end of September, I went over to the Antelope bookstore and bought a copy of my first book of poetry I'd ever bought, and it was The Rarer Game. And I took it back to my apartment, and for the first time, I think in my life, I sat down and read some poems. I read quite a few of those poems. Most of them at the time went right over my head because I really was not an experienced reader of anything. I didn't know at the time, but I really was not an experienced reader at all, but especially of poetry. And I don't know if it was this poem that did it, but this poem's title caught my eye, as I'm sure it would have a lot of you. And the poem's title is Nebraska. I grew up on a farm, but I grew up on a very steady diet of 80s and early 90s pop culture, and I thought that real life happened in the big cities: New York, London, Paris, Moscow, Washington D.C., or even in the rougher parts of the world like Brooklyn or Compton or those kinds of places. And I didn't know that important things could happen. I mean, I kind of knew that from my own experience, but I wasn't able to bring that out in writing. So I virtually guarantee at the time this poem caught my attention. Here we go, Nebraska. Going west when the sun is going down, following the highways like light cords. If Nebraska were the name of a Russian woman they could love her, there would be a certain large-boned beauty about her. Or she would be dressed in black and lace. Her waist would be small, and she would drag her long dress over a floor into a study lined with French books. She would be a pawn in huge novels of war. As it is, she's a woman of spare beauty. Turning away from him so that the fine hollows of her back were toward the bed, she said, "Why do you do this to me? Why do you keep imagining me in other places and states? And why do you keep assuming our children are unhappy?" Well, that was one of the first Welch poems that I ever read. And when I approached Don about Homing, I knew I was very familiar with his work from 1995 to the present because I had read most everything. He had sent me a copy of most every book that he had published from then on. I was really interested to read the works from 1975 to 1995. I had read some of the major poems, of course. I read The Rarer Game, but I was really interested to see what he had done before I met him. And I was really taken aback by how quickly he came to poetry writing late, in his 40s, I believe. And immediately, within a very short period of time, he was writing some of his very best poems for his whole lifetime. I was particularly happy in looking at the early books in finding some poems that I had never read and had never seen before. Here is one that has become one of my favorites in all of homing. If you already have a copy, this is on 78 and 79. I'm sorry, I should have given you the page number. This is a fictional situation, imagining what it would have been like if Emily Dickinson had sent some of her poems to Gerard Manley Hopkins. Okay, tough enough to picture, but then of course we know that Hopkins never really enjoyed really robust physical health and was constantly ill. And this is from the point of view of his younger sister writing a letter back to Emily Dickinson. This is incredible. Okay, I know this feeling very well though that she's describing. My dear Miss Dickinson, I regret to say my brother, Gerard Manley Hopkins, now in the north of Wales, is terribly ill. Could he would thank you for your poems, especially the one which begins, I cannot want it more, I cannot want it less, my human nature's fullest force expends itself on this. Young, in choice limbo, Gerard often sat at our kitchen table with his cursed, blessed words, in love with the oddest shapes. But I dare say, the right one found, he carried it home the way a Northumbrian would bring a lost sheep into the kitchen, his arms and shoulders dead, his spirit almost broken. Miss Dickinson, I do not fully understand my brother or his poems, but I know this. The right one made, he walks in peace, wearing its corona. And how long or brief it lasts is not the substantial question. And so I thank you for Gerard, whose words right now play across his body weakly. Next to the Father, though, silence has always been the best ghost for my brother. It also makes demands. In time, he may be strong enough to write again. He may be fit. If not, his life for it. Gerard Manley Hopkins' younger sister, winter 1874, in the reign of Christ our Lord and the Queen, Victoria. Any of you who have ever written poetry and really pulled one off that you were really happy with, you know that feeling. You know that feeling very well. I'm just glad that's not behind me. I'm so happy. What a relief. I'm in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it's October, so I have to read something about football. This is a poem that, well, in putting the book Homing together, of course, it was a ton of fun. Don kept thanking me over and over again. Well, I kept thinking to myself, well, the honor's mine. If I had a bias in editing this book, it was toward his sports poems. If he wrote a sports poem, it is probably in this book, and I take full blame or credit for that. Here is one of his early poems that is about a flanker in football, and I've seen this under a couple of titles, but I do want to take credit for the fact that I found a version of it that says "To Vern" about a flanker, and I like that title because I know Vern Plambeck is the one he was talking to here, and he was another professor of mine that I adored. To Vern about a flanker. Breaking from the huddle, he begs a portrait no camera can give him, of his father running all day, of his mother catching eggs thrown from the lofts of barns. In the howling bowl of a Saturday afternoon, he watches a cornerback wave his forearm clubs, and then he's gone, beyond the free safety, measuring a liquid distance of yard lines, picking seams in the sunlight, because this is the way he is, always was, stretched out, his toes just kissing the turf, a palm at the end of a crowd. If this were a scene in modern football, in 2016 football, you'd have some linebacker running at him with his head down, using his head as a spear, and driving this farm boy into the ground. I do wish football was played differently, but anyway. I want to invite you, if you buy a copy of Homing, or if one happens into your hands, where do you start reading in a almost 300-page book of poetry? Where do you begin? You can begin with some of his favorites, as I'm sure a lot of you have some favorites. You can, open it up anywhere. William Stafford calls that nibbling olives. Just open up anywhere, put your finger down, and there it is. When you create a book like this, there are surprises happen. There were surprises for me, but there were also some surprises for Don, good surprises. We know Don had a couple things to say about how his statement, writing will find you out, poems come from your hidden head, and so on. That writing and poetry allows your subconscious, whatever word you want to put on it, make connections that you might not have been able to do out here in the world. This is a connection that I don't think was conscious on either one of our parts until he saw it, and then it became really, really meaningful. I would invite you, if you do obtain a copy of the book, to begin with both the first and the last poems and playing them off each other. This was a pure accident, but one of those moments of serendipity that I don't know, it was really meaningful. The first poem in the book is literally on page 1. And this is from his first book, Dead Horse Table. I don't know if this was the first poem he ever wrote, but it's the first poem in the first book, so it owns some significance that way. Keep your finger there and jump to page 294. And we're going to go back and forth. Okay, we'll start with the first poem, Lines from My Father. You can tell from the early poems, hunting with his father was a very meaningful activity for Don, and he wrote some incredibly good early poems about that. So it's called Lines from My Father. And then the last poem is called Reloading Shells. And I don't know what people in the room know or don't know about guns. So people didn't have as much money. You didn't just go buy new shells. You bought the equipment to remake your own shells. And this was very typical, where when that shotgun shell came out of the shotgun, you would pick it up, and that shell, that plastic shell, could be reused. And you could buy BBs, you could buy gunpowder, and you could buy some of the igniter things inside, and then you could take it home into a machine and actually remake another shotgun shell. And again, I don't mean to insult you, for you already knew that, but I imagine some people don't. So I'm going to read these two back to back, and I'm going to invite you just to notice a lot of things about the connections here across 40 years, across 294 pages of poetry that became obvious to us when we juxtaposed the two. Lines for My Father. I love you, old man, in our time. The shotgun cradled in your arm, the marbled wood, the varnished sky. The Milo's cut, the fence holds leaves. The thicket has its quail and the final green. We walk, we clot in time. The fence sings birdless in the wind. "40 years later, reloading shells. The table where my father loaded shells was no wider than a shelf. His powder set to trigger storms, his steel shot hard like discipline. It was a love which kept him at it late at night, as if the dark, once measured out and primed, could have its life tucked in. I'd hear him from my bed, bringing the crimper down and down, each shell ending in a starburst, sealing some clay pigeon's fate. I write this as a shell myself. I chamber memory. It's late." The first poem takes us out into the field, where you have this connection through hunting that becomes all the more meaningful because of course, the poem. And then that last poem is really worth your time. This is from a little collection called The Keeper's Pile that never really saw print anywhere else. It was a collection, I think, of 10 that he sent around to a few of us and asked which ones we liked the most. And I think there were 5, maybe 6 that we all tended to agree on, he said. But look at that last poem, Reloading Shells. It's a poem about beginning, clear at the end of his life where perhaps he was even sicker than he himself knew. And it's a poem about going back out and starting all over again. And this guy had energy like I just hope to have someday in my life. Do you mind if I reread you Reloading Shells? Can I do it again? Okay, Reloading Shells. The table where my father loaded shells was no wider than a shelf. Its powder set to trigger storms, his steel shot hard like discipline. It was a love which kept him at it late at night, as if the dark, once measured out and primed, could have its life tucked in. I'd hear him from my bed, bringing the crimper down and down, each shell ending in a starburst, sealing some clay pigeon's fate. I write this as a shell myself. I chamber memory. It's late. That's amazing, folks. I'm sorry. Sorry to repeat it. Anyway, if you do obtain a copy of Homing, I invite you to start with those two poems and then take it from there. Thank you all very much. I appreciate being invited down.
You heard from Jeff. He introduced our wonderful artist for the cover. In a serendipity thing, we noticed that as soon as Marcia sat down, I looked up on the wall and there's an amazing picture of a pigeon from the artist of the month. It wasn't planned. It ended up above her chair. And the pigeon is sitting on a branch. It looks kind of offhandedly checking out whatever some of my friends didn't finish on dinner plates over here. That's a part of something you can imagine and write about. Who knows? When we leave, the pigeon may get down and out of the painting and pick up a few scraps. Those are the things that you work on with imagination. We're going to take a short break here. Do take the tour. Do look at the Welch poems on the page. Do think about buying a book if you want to read a poem. We have a list up here for open mic if you'd like to take 2 or 3 minutes and tell a Don story or something like that, 4 or 5 minutes, put your name on the list. We will take as much time as we need. That's the way it works. The last class I saw Don gave was one of his philosophy of literature classes. It was a 2¼ hour lecture straight through, no notes, no chaser, no ice, just straight through. Absolutely out of memory. He brought everything to bear. He was offhanded and deliberate and just stuck some of those students up against the wall. They were plastered there with just the sheer genius of the information and the wonderful delivery. And at the same time, they were having fun. They loved getting pinned to the wall with something like that. That's the beauty of it. So, short break, 10 minutes, buy a book, visit. Marcia's up here, the pigeon's up there, take pictures, say hi, get another drink, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes and sign the list.